schedule. Maybe people have some plans for later. So Peter, thank you very much. I think most people know you here. Maybe not Jennifer, who is new in the group. So Jennifer Peter is a member of Kannon Do, and he is going to be talking today about income inequality and wealth and how that relates to racial justice. And he will explore it from general point of view and also how the issues that we are facing in our community and in Zen practice. So Peter, thank you very much for being with us today and giving this talk.
Thank you, Teresa. And good morning, everybody. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you all today. Jennifer, it's really nice to meet you, and it's always nice to see everyone else. It feels like a privilege to have a chance to talk with all of you. I wanted to particularly thank you, Teresa, for organizing this and creating a space for this talk to happen. And I also wanted to thank Bonnie and Vanessa for encouraging me to prepare this talk and to find a time to speak about this. I wanted to start by explaining a little bit about how I came around to wanting to talk about this in this context and at this time. I've been concerned with wealth inequality and homelessness and economic justice for kind of as long as I can remember. But if the recent examples of racial injustice, particularly with George Floyd, kind of really brought this back to the fore. And as I began learning more in what I think of as one of my responsibilities as a privileged white man in our society about the history of racial inequality, racial injustice, and racial violence, I found myself coming back around to questions of economic inequality and economic justice, and particularly finding kind of a renewed understanding of how that's playing out in our broader society, but also our local community. So I began researching with more of more fervently recently, and then when I asked a question about if anybody else knew of any other organizations nearby in our WhatsApp group, the Kannon Do WhatsApp group, many people expressed interest in also thinking about the subject, and so that's what kind of prompted me to think about, this might be something that we'd like to talk about together. Today, notably, this is not a Dharma talk. I wanted to focus today just on kind of more of a contextual understanding of what is the history or recent history of economic inequality, economic justice in the U.S. How is that playing out locally? What are some of the ways in which this shapes and affects our society? And what are some of the kind of things that are currently happening, particularly in Mountain View and Silicon Valley? I think that there's a significant question that I'd really like us to have a conversation about, which is, how does this relate to our practice? How does it relate to the Dharma? And what responsibility do we individually bear, and how do we approach this personally and as a community? So I have I have some comments and notes on that, particularly from the sutras. But what I'd like to do today is really actually to provide more context and observations and facts, and end with a story from the sutras, and then mostly for us to have a conversation about this and a discussion. I find that one of the things I value most is our conversations and discussions and what I learn from that. Um, so I look forward to that. Now, notably, I think I may have prepared a 3 or 4 hour talk. Um, so I'm going to try to compress it into 45 minutes. I have the participants view in Zoom up. And so if anybody wants to, I'm going to be going kind of quickly and staying relatively high level, but I can go into more detail on most of the things that I'll be touching on. So please, raise your hand, come to Gasho, press the button to raise your hand in Zoom. Happy to stop in the middle and answer any questions or go into any more detail on any of these that I can. Okay. I think there are three things that I want to kind of get across today. One is that um, wealth and income inequality and economic justice is a systematic, is a system of injustice in our society, and it's deeply connected to racial injustice and racism in the U.S. And worldwide too, I think. But I concern myself mostly with the U.S. and California and our local community. Um, as a system of injustice, I think that we all bear personal responsibility as members of the society in which this is happening. And I think it's a responsibility of ours to understand that and examine the way that it manifests in our lives and the way that our lives participate in it. And third, there are things we can do. There are organizations locally. There are things that we can do personally in our day-to-day actions that can have a positive effect. So those are the three things that I want to motivate and get across today that feel really important to me. Um, I want to start really in as I get into the more details. I want to start with first with a note on a bit of a theoretical question, kind of a theory of justice and economic equality. Um, uh, there's a kind of a classic understanding of justice, which is, generally, do people in a society get what they deserve, both positively and negatively. A just society is one in which people might rightfully benefit from the fruits of their labors, and also might rightfully suffer from the consequences of their actions. This is kind of classic and kind of the root of a lot of our society's approach and policies. When you think about economic justice and economic justice, particularly in the U.S., there's kind of a classic version, which is what the American dream is kind of rooted in, which is uh, for everyone to have equality of opportunity, that everybody should be treated fairly, everyone should be treated equally. From the starting point, everyone should have equal opportunity um, to benefit from the fruits of their labors. There's an alternate version of economic justice, which is equality of outcome. This is kind of like the core debate through different economic systems. Equality of outcome being justice is everyone being treated equally in terms of the actual outcomes of the economic system, of everybody having access to food, everyone having access to housing, everyone having equal wealth. Um, and one of the challenging things I think about the kind of classically American approach of focusing on equality of opportunity is that um, uh, you really actually can't have equality of opportunity without some measure of equality of outcome. because of inheritance, because of the way in which parents teach their children, provide their children with opportunities, because of the way that wealth is passed down between generations. Even if you start with a perfectly equal society in which everyone has perfectly equal access to opportunity, after a single generation, there will inevitably be, because of different outcomes and the way in which opportunity is inherited between generations, there will immediately be an inequality of opportunity. And so I think it's very, very important to understand that there is actually no equality of opportunity without some measure of equality of outcome. And I think that we have a responsibility as a society to provide that. Um, there's a really good book if you're interested in learning more about this called Capitalism and Justice, which goes into this into great detail, and I included that in the notes on the talk. There's an interesting effect also of inequality on society, which is really kind of sociological. Um, as I was researching this, I came across a lot of research. I think that the ways in which inequality and particularly poverty have really horrendous effects on people who are living in poverty is pretty well studied and I think pretty well understood. There's higher stress, higher mortality, worse health, higher violence experienced by people who live in poverty or in lower income parts of society. But one thing that and in talking about this, I in no way mean to diminish um, the profound effects of poverty and on people in lower income parts of society. Um, but one thing that I found was interesting is that there's a growing body of research into how does inequality actually affect people who are wealthy um, uh, in society, and actually documenting the really harmful and negative ways in which wealth affects people. Uh, Particularly in terms of inequality, there's an interesting effect where it's generally understood that it's generally well documented that in a society with high inequality, particularly in the U.S., people who are wealthy tend to actually be less generous. And there's always been a question of, is that cause or effect? Um, does being less generous make you wealthy? But actually, it's looking like it's actually more of an effect. Actually, being wealthy makes you less generous in really, I think, challenging and corrosive ways. There's a few studies. Now, I tried to read the studies, but I'm not a sociologist, so I don't feel qualified to comment on the quality of the studies or the validity of the conclusions, but they seemed to be well regarded. Um, Notably, high income individuals are only less generous if they reside in a highly unequal area or when inequality is experimentally portrayed as relatively high. So it seems that like wealth doesn't make you less generous, but actually being aware that there's inequality makes you less generous when you understand yourself to be on the upper end. Experimentally here was actually through a game of Monopoly, where people were given uh, an unequal starting condition. People who were disadvantaged tended to be more generous. People who were advantaged tended to be less generous. And uh, Notably, there's some research into this which actually demonstrates that this is actually you can detect this neurologically. The way in which inequality has a detectable and measurable effects on wealthy people's brains. It decreases compassion, it decreases generosity, um, and it may be that well, and actually also notably, it actually makes people less able to recognize faces, which suggests that inequality actually uh, causes of reduces the ability of wealthy people in an unequal society to experience compassion and empathy and connection, which I think should be of concern to all of us, particularly as we in our community concern ourselves, I think, really highly with connection and empathy and understanding and an understanding of interconnectedness. There was one study that actually found that it suggested that there's actually a blindness to suffering as a psychological adaptation to discomfort caused by extreme wealth disparities. Uh, People find inequality distressing, and it may be that in that distress, we actually learn to become blind to it as a way of protecting ourselves from that discomfort. Um, and this plays out actually in a measurably decreased ability to read emotions in other people's faces. And actually, wealthy people's brains showed less activity than the brains of poor people when they looked at photos of children with cancer. Um, and so, beyond the well understood ways in which inequality and poverty really is really harmful to the poor and the disadvantaged, it actually is also similarly corrosive and damaging to the brains and empathy of people who are wealthy. Um, so I found it really interesting to see this kind of growing body of research and understanding of how inequality is corrosive and harmful to everybody in society at really fundamental ways. So I want to bring this also back to and I'll note that I was doing a kind of a broad set of research, and so some of this is potentially may seem a little disjoint. If we think about this as like inequality and economic injustice as an elephant, and we all touch different parts of it and say it's this or it's that, I kind of want to show like some more of the outline of the elephant today. So I'm going to touch on a few different kinds of things. Um, so inequality and racial injustice. There's I think it's really important to actually understand that wealth and income inequality can't be separated from the history of racism and racial injustice in the U.S. Um, and I'll try to explain why through two key examples. So one of the key ways in which family wealth is built in the U.S. is through home ownership and property ownership. And the history of access to property ownership in the U.S. is inextricably linked to the history of racism and racial inequality. There's two specific examples that I want to share, and I know that several of us are. These may be familiar to some of us, but I know some of us are still trying to learn about all of this history. So I want to go over this, but please, if you have questions more specifically, please raise your hands. Um, so one particular way in which racial inequality and racial injustice uh, directly influenced economic inequality was through redlining. Um, During the Great Depression, back in the 1930s, there was a large economic development initiative generally called the New Deal. And in the New Deal, there was a law passed, which was the National Housing Act of 1934, and that established the Federal Housing Administration. Um, in 1935, so just 1 year later, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, established the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which asked the Homeowners Loan Corporation, these are all institutions that continue to exist today, um, to look at 239 cities in the US and create residential security maps. These were maps that categorized every city into 4 categories, A, B, C, and D, which were preferential, which were maps of how risky it is to offer mortgages to properties in those areas. The Federal Housing Administration was offering insurance on mortgages that would substantially reduce the cost of getting access to home loans for people who were trying to buy houses. And these maps generally basically define like how expensive is it to get a loan for purchasing a property. Redlining, the term, comes from the fact that on these maps, the most disadvantaged neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that were considered highest risk, were marked red and outlined in red. So a redlined neighborhood was considered very, very risky, and actually would often not get any home mortgage insurance from the federal government. And so it was very, very difficult to get a mortgage at an affordable rate there. These red line neighborhoods were generally the black neighborhoods, or the Hispanic neighborhoods, or the Chinese neighborhoods. And notably, it seems that the federal agencies didn't explicitly speak in racial terms, but they contracted out the creation of these maps to private entities and local governments, which were very explicitly racist in their mapping and their decisions around this. Is it possible for me to share my screen?
I'm sure
Teresa?
I can make you host.
Yes, thank you. What I'd like to show you is the redlining map of San Jose.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Uh, There we go. Let's see, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So this is a really great tool from a university in Richmond, which actually shows every one of the 239 redlining maps. And this is showing over the Bay Area. You can see there's a redline map for Oakland, as well as for San Francisco. I want to look today at the one in San Jose. And so you can explore all of the history of this kind of nationwide through this tool. What I think is important to look at here is actually, if you're familiar with the neighborhoods in San Jose, you might notice that the green here is grade A. That's the best. Those were the neighborhoods that were offered the cheapest home loans, and the red are the neighborhoods that were generally not given any insurance for their home loans. There's notes in associated with this, which were the actual written justifications for why the neighborhoods were given which designations. And I found particularly, let's see if I can find the notes for D10. Wait, let me see. Oh, sorry, wait, let me reload this. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah, if we look at D10, the note was that this section contains the largest concentration of Mexicans in the community. The northern section within the city limits is largely populated by a lower stratum of Italians and Portuguese. This neighborhood now, Alum Rock, is I believe is known as Little Portugal. from a racial standpoint, this area is extremely undesirable. So the actual policy by which the U.S. federal government was giving housing assistance through ensuring loans, and remember the access to property and access to home ownership is the single greatest driver of family wealth within the U.S. Was explicitly racist and explicitly disadvantaged minority communities. Let's see. See it? Okay, stop share. Great. Notably, also, now redlining only existed officially in 239 cities in the US. But when my wife and we went to the Mountain View Library, where there's a small, this is when the Mountain View Library was open, there's a small historical society there. And we were asking them about the history of our neighborhood. I live in Mountain View in Shoreline West. And when we were talking with the historian there, they shared that the Shoreline West neighborhood was predominantly a Seventh-day Adventist neighborhood. And actually, though it wasn't subject to like federal redlining, it was in practice subject to redlining because of religious discrimination. The Seventh-day Adventist community was really looked down on in the 50s and 60s, and the entire neighborhood was denied access to home loans and mortgages. And ultimately, the city rezoned the entire neighborhood as medium residential once it became part of the city limits. And this actually led to the Seventh-day Adventist community being displaced through essentially a redevelopment of the neighborhood from single-family homes and ranch houses into multi-unit apartment complexes. And so we have a direct consequence of this history of bias, both racial and religious, against disadvantaged communities next door in San Jose, but also immediately here in Mountain View, in the form of housing policy and mortgage access. The other big example of this that I wanted to explain was the GI Bill. So after the Second World War, veterans were returning from Europe and the Pacific, and the U.S. passed the GI Bill, GI for General Infantry, which provided a lot of benefits to veterans, particularly including cheap home loans. So again, granting housing assistance. But also access to education and unemployment benefits. In the federal language of the laws, you won't find racist terminology, but there was a concern among the southern states that there would be sufficient sympathy for returning Black veterans that it would undermine the Jim Crow laws in the South. There were about 1.3 million returning Black veterans. And so if you go back through the history of the legislation, you'll find representatives from southern states very directly agitating to ensure that the benefits of the GI Bill were applied in a systematically racist way. And they were quite successful, unfortunately. Notably, in 1947, there were 3,200 Veterans Administration guaranteed home loans in Mississippi. 2 of them went to Black families. This wasn't limited to the South, though. In New York and New Jersey, there were 67,000 mortgages guaranteed by the Veterans Administration. There were less than 100 of those that went to non-white veterans. And also, in terms of access to education, one of the other great drivers of opportunity and wealth in our nation. Well, Black students weren't allowed into white colleges, and Black universities were overwhelmed by the number of veterans trying to gain access to education. And many of the Black universities weren't accredited. And so there was a really, really stark gap in access to education as well. And this persists today. In 2017, the median income in the US for white households was $68,000 per year. For Black households, it was $40,000. So what I mean to emphasize through all of this is 2 points. One, you can't talk about wealth and income inequality without talking about racial inequality and racial justice and the history of racism in the US. And two, I also don't think that you can really talk about wealth or income inequality without talking about housing policy. This is one of the reasons why I tend to focus so much on access to housing, the price of housing, access to affordable housing, and housing policy in state and local governments, and federally, of course. So I want to also talk about some more current statistics, a picture of what is inequality today, particularly in our nation, in our state, and in our community. It's discouraging. Inequality in the US is extremely high globally. Inequality in California is actually comparable to inequality nationwide, but inequality in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area is actually among the highest in the nation, which puts it among the highest in the world. There's a measure of inequality called the Gini coefficient. It's a little bit of a complicated formula. I won't explain it, but suffice to know that it's on a scale from 0 to 1. 0 would be perfect equality, where everyone in a society has perfectly equal wealth. 1 would be perfect inequality, in which everybody except one person has no wealth and one person has all the wealth. Globally, it's important to measure the Gini coefficient within a community. So it only makes sense to compare the comparative wealth of people within a community. And globally, the range of coefficients within nations tends between 0.25 and 0.49. So the most equal society, the nations in the world with the most equality rank around 0.25. The Swedish, the Scandinavian countries come out well in this regard. I think Finland is one of the most equal societies in the world. The worst come out around 0.49. I think by this measure, South Africa is the most unequal nation in the world. But the US is not very far behind. We come out around 0.48. So we're right up there among the most unequal nations in the world. Actually, California comes out quite poorly. California comes out at 0.49, so right up there with South Africa as a whole. The Bay Area comes out at 40.487. So the Bay Area is right up there with the most unequal communities in the entire world. More discouragingly, this is getting worse over time. From 1989 to 2013, the Bay Area Gini coefficient increased from 0.405 to 0.487, which is a 20% increase. In the same period, the state had a 14% increase and the nation had a 12% increase. So the Bay Area is among the most unequal areas in the world, and it's getting worse faster than the rest of the state and the rest of the nation. In fact, actually, the Bay Area's Gini coefficient is currently the highest it's ever been recorded in history. So this is sobering and discouraging statistics. Interestingly, it actually went down. It decreased during the 2008 financial recession, but it really shot back up after that. There's another statistic you can look at, which is the ratio of household income between the top 20% and the bottom 20%. Nationally, this ratio is 16.4. So the top 20% of the US earns 16.4 times as much as the bottom 20%. The Bay Area, perhaps unfortunately, unsurprisingly at this point, is worse than nationally. It's 17.9 times higher in the top 20th percent. Just a couple more details there. Actually, in the Bay Area, Marin County is the worst. The difference in median household income between the top 20% and bottom 20% is $400,000. San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara come in around the middle at around $300,000 difference in the median household income. And among the Bay Area, actually, it's the northern counties, the northern rural counties of Napa, Solano, and Sonoma have the lowest ratio. They have about a $200,000 difference in median household income. And notably, just the last sobering statistic I'll share here is that the Bay Area's inequality is in the top 10% of equivalently sized areas in the US. So the Bay Area is within the US among the most unequal. Now, I hope it's clear at this point why I think it's so important to concern ourselves with housing when we talk about wealth and inequality. There's an excellent book if you want to learn more about this, which I included in the notes for this talk, called Evicted. It gives both a very, very humanizing understanding of the way in which access to stable housing systematically disadvantages the people who are already disadvantaged, as well as a much more thorough understanding of the current state of both of the U.S. And of current housing policy. It's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. Evicted. There's a link in the notes for this talk. Now, I think that there are some encouraging notes here, though, which is in city and state housing policy. So notably, I think that actually, so one of the key things here then is increasing access to stable housing, increasing access to affordable housing. And actually, Mountain View City is actually an encouraging example in this. Mountain View City in 2018, or I think in 2017, approved a city plan that calls for over the next 7 years, but it was a 10-year city plan, which called for constructing an additional 10,000 housing units. This is among the most aggressive city plans in the Bay Area for increasing the total supply of housing. And a large portion of those housing units are actually earmarked for being affordable units where they're subsidized and where the rent and cost of the housing is controlled. This is in sharp contrast to our immediate neighbor, Palo Alto, whose city plan for the same period actually called for constructing not 10,000 additional housing units, but actually just 100, which I think can be seen as actually kind of strongly protecting the value of property by not increasing the total supply. The cost of each unit of housing actually will be expected to rise. However, this interplays with state housing policy. In 2017, our then Governor Jerry Brown signed into law State Bill 35, which actually directly affects the way in which cities in California have control over the approval of additional development. State Bill 35 actually, it was targeted at streamlining the construction of additional housing and increasing the total supply of housing in California. It essentially requires that states approve housing development projects provided that they meet certain criteria. And notably, it also sets certain milestones which cities have to meet in terms of their development goals. So if I believe it's if a city doesn't meet within 5 years a certain percentage of their actual housing development plans, which are, there's quotas set for each city by the statewide laws and mandates. And if the cities aren't meeting those within 5 years of a 10-year period, the city will actually lose the authority over approving or not approving development projects. That authority will be taken by the state. And this was designed to directly combat NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, of cities not wanting to have additional development or having changes within their cities. And so, notably, if you happen to value local control of our city's developments, of Mountain View's development particularly, or Palo Alto's development, or Santa Clara's development, it's actually important that our elected officials, and particularly our housing departments, are actually proactive in approving the required number of additional housing units. And so if you're interested in this, I do recommend learning a bit more about the recent laws and changes there. In Mountain View further, there's of course a particularly salient issue right now of people living in unstable housing, particularly in RVs and trailers and camper vans, where they're parking on city streets. And I do want to draw everyone's attention to an issue that's on our ballot. If you live in Mountain View, there's an issue on our ballot called Measure C, which will be something that you'll have a chance to vote on in the upcoming election. And Measure C, if approved, will restrict people who are living in RVs or trailers, will prohibit them from parking on streets that are less than 40 feet wide. Now, notably, if you're familiar with Mountain View, you might be familiar with the street somewhat close to Kannon Do, which is bordering the Caltrain tracks, where there's a large community of people living in trailers. That street is 39 feet wide, and so that entire community would be displaced. And if you care about this and you have an opinion on this, and you may be able to guess what my opinion on this is, if you care about this, I would also recommend becoming familiar with the views of the council, the people who are up for election to city council in this coming election, because this is definitely one of the important issues that everyone is campaigning on. And so there's an opportunity to very directly affect local housing policy in this upcoming election. Now, if you're interested in understanding what you can do personally, and I think perhaps also what I'd suggest that we think about doing as a community, there are several organizations that are active locally who are particularly concerned with housing policy, access to stable housing, particularly concerned with serving and supporting the local homeless population, and the unstably homed, the people who are living in trailers and RVs. One is Move Mountain View, Move MV. That's movemv.org. They're an organization that started in 2016, and they bring together faith communities, nonprofits, and government agencies to try to actually, one of the most significant things that they've been trying to do is to find safe parking spaces, to find parking lots. Particularly right now, they're working on getting the shoreline amphitheaters parking lots designated as a safe place where people can live and park their trailers and RVs. And so that's one organization that's trying to find some measure of stability for some of the most disadvantaged people in our community. There's also a very active local homeless shelter called Life Moves. And they operate many homeless shelters throughout the Bay Area, particularly in our community. This is something I'd like to invite if other people are interested to talk with me about. Unfortunately I've tried to see if it was possible to go and help out at their shelters to prepare meals or food. They're really only set up to have groups of people come in to prepare meals for people in their homeless shelters. And so I think we have an opportunity, if we wanted to, we could get together a group to go and volunteer there to prepare food and prepare meals for the homeless. But unfortunately, it's not something that anyone can do individually. It's only available if you organize a group. But I'd be interested in organizing that. Please let me know if you're interested. And then one other interesting note, there's another organization. This is a little esoteric, but actually the Silicon Valley Bike Exchange is an organization that takes donations of old and beaten up and broken bicycles. And they, through volunteers, repair the bicycles, fix them up, get them working in good condition. Oh, great, Dave. Let's talk. The Silicon Valley Bike Exchange fixes these bikes and then donates them to homeless shelters. So they're trying to give mobility and better access to the homeless populations by donating them, well-functioning, well-repaired, reliable bicycles. And this is they're not open right now. Coronavirus has closed down a lot of organizations that are providing support to the homeless, which is a particularly bad time to be reducing support. But as soon as they open back up, I would invite anybody to join me there. If you know how to repair bikes, it's great. If you don't know how to repair bikes, they'll teach you. So you can also learn a new skill. And then lastly, if you're interested in broader housing policy, there's another organization, this is national, the Corporation for Supportive Housing. They concern themselves with policy advocacy for affordable housing nationwide. They're very active in California, but particularly also for a concept of supportive housing, which is essentially rather than a city or a state spending lots of money on providing services to homeless populations, like paying for their visits to emergency rooms or providing food assistance or basically responding to emergencies. Rather, actually, can you just spend that money on paying for an apartment to get them off the street and also provide them social services? Provide them access to food, provide them access to job training. So the concept of supportive housing as a way of supporting the disadvantaged and homeless populations is I think a really positive approach, and it's been proven to be really effective. And if you're interested in that, the Corporation for Supportive Housing is kind of like the key advocacy organization for that, and they're active locally in San Jose particularly. All right, so I wanted to conclude with actually a story from a sutra. So bringing this back from the kind of more practical and contemporary effects to actually a story from Shakyamuni Buddha on poverty, and I think also on policy that contains, I think, some important lessons. So I'll relate this sutra, and then I have a few questions to pose to us for us to end on, and hopefully to have a conversation about. This is sutra. I'm going to butcher this. Kakavati Shananda Sutta. The lion's roar on the turning of the wheel. I'm sure I've butchered that pronunciation. Um, but it's a story related by Shakyamuni Buddha to his students, and I'll summarize it. I can provide a link also to the actual text if anyone's interested. But it's a story that chronicles over 8 generations the gradual decline of a somewhat idyllic society into increasing trouble and suffering, um, eventually reaching a point where the society collapsed into a degenerate free-for-all, in which there was violence, murder, greed, unsupport, addiction, and abuse, and in which all of those are celebrated as norms. Um, in the sutta, the fall begins actually with a governance and policy failure. Um, this was a society ruled by an enlightened king, and his seventh heir made a mistake of not fully consulting with his ministers and advisors uh, when responding to evidence of poverty in the capital city. Rather than taking the advice of his advisors and responding appropriately, he responded unskillfully, and eventually began to try more and more and more to control the behavior of his people. The first mistake that he made was allowing poverty to rise to the point where theft began to occur. At which point, he decided to just give money to the thieves, so that they could support their families without crime. The thieves were stealing bread to try to support their families who were living in poverty. In the story, then other people hear of this and interpret it to mean that theft is rewarded with money from the king, and so more people begin stealing. The king then responded by beheading one of the thieves as a warning to, don't steal. And then the people see this as evidence that they should kill the people from whom they steal, so that they can't report the crime. And on and on and on. Actually, this descends into, well, a degenerate society, until finally a group of people recognize this and separate themselves from the society and refuse to endorse or participate in what had become the norms and institutions of violence and greed and avarice and ungenerosity and disconnection. And they form their own community based on good deeds, uh, loving kindness, compassion, joy in the good fortune of others, equanimity. These may all be familiar to us. And ultimately, it's through their right action and skill that society over many, many, many generations recovers and returns to its enlightened state. So I think that there's a few lessons that I took from this story, uh, which I find, personal lessons in how does our practice relate to economic justice, inequality, and poverty. One is, and I think this is emphasized by Shakyamuni in many, many other stories that he tells, is the importance of addressing poverty, and the importance of poverty, and the importance of addressing the suffering that poverty causes. That poverty and inequality is a critical concern for our society. Um, Further, that it's important to respond skillfully to poverty. Um, that many policy actions or ways that one could address poverty can really make the problem so much worse. And in the story, the way in which unskillful policy after unskillful policy is layered on top of each other reminds me of when you're sick and you take some medicine that has some unpleasant side effect, and you take another medicine to address that side effect, which causes another side effect, and on and on and on and on. Um, that pattern plays out also in our societies in the way that we build policies to address poverty, inequality, and then to address the consequences of the policies that we put into place to address poverty and inequality, and the way in which that causes its own kinds of problems. And then lastly, the final lesson that I was taking from this story is the way in which, of course, the ultimate aid to this is through a community practicing non-attachment, through practicing non-greed, through not stealing, through loving kindness, through building community, through building connection. Um, and this is something I take deep encouragement from, and I think also deep inspiration from, and I think brings me back to one of the things I was relating at the very beginning of this talk, which is the corrosive effects of wealth on the wealthy within an unequal society, and the ways in which that measurably changes people's brains and their ability to experience empathy and compassion and consideration and generosity, um, and the consequent importance of us practicing this and advocating for compassion, connection, generosity, non-attachment, um, and working to alleviate suffering. So that's where I'd like to end today. I had a few questions that might prompt discussion, but maybe I'll just stop there and open up for any other comments or questions. Unfortunately, I didn't take 4 hours. I only took one. So we have, I think, 30 minutes remaining for conversation.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for all you share, a lot of interesting information. I think Dave has a question.
Yes.
Peter, I just want to start by saying I really, really appreciate your talk. I think we all do, and it certainly has left me with 100 questions buzzing around in my head, but following your nice example, I will try to limit myself from not asking 100 questions. If you'll bear with me, I do have two. The first one is kind of more personal, and the second one is more sort of social and political. The personal one, when I was a kid, when I was growing up, I was raised by parents who were, I don't think by modern standards at least you would call them radical leftists, but they were about as far left in the Democratic Party as you could get. They were Adlai Stevenson Democrats who raised me to think that Richard Nixon was the Antichrist. And they were very, very anti-racist, in the style of the time, of course, the kind of liberals who felt that they didn't even see race, it was invisible to them. There was one episode I remember where an old Southern gentleman who was a relative of ours came and was regaling the family with his stories from his youth until he got to the point where he used the N-word in front of my mother's children, at which point I thought she was going to physically assault him and throw him. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that my father, for essentially his entire career, worked for the FHA. And his job was not directly connected with anything about redlining or anything. His job was actually to see that new construction was not built by such shoddy contractors that the houses would fall down the next time there was a storm or a flood or a landslide or something. But nevertheless, it's very sobering to me. I wish that he was still alive and I could talk to him about this, because I'm sure that I would assume that he would have been outraged by this kind of redlining that you're talking about. And I'm wondering, especially since, as you mentioned, this was sort of outsourced to private companies, was there any sort of effect of this to sort of shield a lot of the people in the federal government, even in the FHA, from the actual fact that this was going on?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. That's a great question. I think so. I don't feel personally very familiar with the kind of subsequent history of the FHA and redlining. Certainly, the practice was challenged and ultimately discontinued as a consequence of the Civil Rights Act. And the Equal Housing Amendment to all of these legislations. I don't know that I don't know of any examples of anybody in the federal government being punished or having consequences, if I'm understanding your question correctly, because of the practice of redlining. Unfortunately, because it was legal at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
At the time that the maps were written, I mean, you'll notice that the remarks, the justifications for why the neighborhoods were classified as red, why they were redlined, the comments, the official justifications were explicitly racist.
Yes, yes.
And that was okay because it was legal to do that at the time.
Yes, another thing, sort of not from the government, but parallel at the time, was racial restrictive covenants and deeds.
Yes.
And I do remember hearing my parents talk about that. And my father was absolutely outraged by the existence of these things and was very relieved when legislation started to advance that made them go away. But let me quickly move on to my other question, because then I want other people to have time. I was just reading about a new book, which I'm planning to put on my teetering reading list, called The Cult of Smart, by a fellow named Freddie DeBoer. It's about a phenomenon he refers to as bell curve leftism. And basically what he's getting at is the fundamental idea that we sort of treat as a shibboleth in the United States, which is equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity, that is the gold standard, and there's this whole mythology around, Horatio Alger and all of this stuff. And one way of looking at equality of outcome is that it's a gauge, as you pointed out, of whether there is actual equality of opportunity. But he actually goes further than that and says, basically, the idea of equality of outcome is perhaps a better social goal than just equality of opportunity. Hence, the notion in particular, the book, The Cult of Smart, and the idea that people should be rewarded for their intelligence, and people who aren't as intelligent should suffer economic deprivation. Which, if you think about it, if you say it that way, it doesn't really sound quite so ideal as saying equality of opportunity, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, blah, blah, blah. And I'm just wondering, what your thoughts might be about this whole notion of perhaps substituting equality of outcome in some form for this shibboleth of equality of opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about it, and I think that what you're getting at is really um, one of the fundamental problems in our society, which is this obsession with meritocracy. Um, and I would agree with you, or maybe agree with the author that you're reading, that um, I don't think meritocracy is the goal.
Yeah, he actually uses the phrase the tyranny of meritocracy.
Yes, yes, or cult of meritocracy, perhaps. Um, um, this is, I think, for me, is a little bit personally difficult to square and confront. In my work, I'm a manager, and it's one of my official duties to judge people based on their merits and reward people according to their merits, and that sometimes feels uncomfortable. Um, but also, I have personal, like, philosophical disagreements with meritocracy. However, what I find helps me the most is one, learning about it, because I have kind of a natural tendency to want to think about these things, but then I think more importantly to forget about it, and just stop thinking about it and actually just concern myself with trying to work to alleviate the suffering of the people who are suffering the consequences of a society that does not have equality of outcome. Trying to work to alleviate the suffering of the people in our community who don't have access to food, who don't have access to stable housing, who don't have access to safe shelter. Um, the Second Harvest Food Bank, which is Silicon Valley's food bank, currently serves 1 in 10 people in Silicon Valley. I think it's horrendous and discouraging that one of the wealthiest areas of the world is also an area in which, well, going back to the statistics I shared about the Silicon Valley being one of the most unequal areas in the world, one in which 10% of people, without, if they weren't given access to free food through charitable acts, would actually be going without food, going without access to nutrition. So I think it's an important conversation of what really are our goals, what are our values? Is meritocracy a value that we actually still believe in? But I think even more importantly is to what I think is even more important is to put that conversation to the side and just focus on trying to on the suffering that exists right now and what we can do to alleviate that.
Yes, well, thank you again so much for your talk, Peter. And I have 98 more questions buzzing around in my head.
Thank you, Dave. I'd love to talk with you about them. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. I wanted to say thank you for your invitation to go to Life Moves, a group of people from Kannon Do who might be interested. So how is it working now with this whole COVID situation? Can a group still go, or?
Yeah, Life Moves is still active. They're very active. They still operate their homeless shelters. They've put into place practices to protect the homeless population as well as to protect the volunteers. I think they're suffering a particular crunch of not having as many people volunteering right now. And so if anything, the need right now is greater than ever. More people are becoming homeless, and there are fewer services available to them. And they're at the greatest risk of anybody in our population from the virus, on top of all of the day-to-day risks to their health of not having stable access to housing or nutrition. But yes, absolutely, they're open to additional groups of people coming in to volunteer. maybe we can maybe have a separate maybe email or point to organize around that. I think it would be really, really a wonderful thing for us to do.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, I can't, unfortunately.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Ria, do you have a question? And then May.
Hi. Actually, I was just telling Travis. When Peter was talking. We used to go to the UU Church of Palo Alto, and Unitarian Universalist Church in Palo Alto, and there used to be a monthly, I believe, volunteering effort where they provide like lunch or dinner to the homeless, like on weekends, and provide showers, just for the homeless. And I was telling Travis, like, the Kannon Do bathrooms are so large. If you guys put showers in there and you have an outdoor garden to feed people, I mean, it's such a big place that, I think bigger than like just going somewhere and serving food. I mean, it's such a wonderful place for people to come visit and have a nice place to stay for like an hour and get a shower. So I don't know. I mean, but I just wanted to mention that I Googled it, and it's actually part of Life Moves. I didn't know that. I just knew that the UU Church was doing this, I believe, once a month, or there was like some monthly weekend where they house the homeless for the weekend. So, but thank you for the organizations you mentioned, Peter. I didn't know some of them, and I also know probably a couple of other places that do things through the Girl Scouts, and I can look through them and maybe send them your way too, in case you didn't know about them. So
Please do. I'd welcome that. And thank you for that point. Building on it also, I feel a little bit uncertain, but perhaps we should have a conversation about this. I'll also point out that we have a reasonably large parking lot. And there is an organization in Mountain View, Move Envy, that's very interested in organizing safe and secure places and access for the unstably homed.
Yeah, especially
Yeah,
now.
thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience and your observations. There were two things that stood out to me. One, now I don't feel very familiar with the history of the Cultural Revolution and China's history with communism and the history of policies. But what I do know of it reminds me very much of the story from Shakyamuni that I related just now. I know one example, Chairman Mao saying, "Kill all the sparrows." The sparrows were eating all of the seeds in the farms, and they took a policy of sparrow eradication to tamp down on the amount of crops that were lost. And then, of course, the next year there was effectively a plague of locusts that weren't controlled by the birds, and there was a famine immediately afterwards. And the history of the Cultural Revolution that I know of strikes me as a history of unskillful policy and unskillful action. The one other note that came to mind, you were touching on questions of algorithmic fairness and algorithmic bias. And I do really want to emphasize how important I think that is, how important it is to our society, particularly how important it is for any of us who work within technology or work within algorithms to be conscious of this and learn about the ways in which seemingly unbiased or unfair or seemingly unbiased or fair application of kind of well, of algorithms that don't explicitly account for race or account for society's biases really are not unfair and are not unbiased, but actually are in many ways a profoundly accelerated form of reinforcing bias within our society and are part of the system of economic injustice and system of oppression within our society. This is very concretely realized in the form of credit ratings and the immediate effect that credit ratings have on access to home loans. Just one example, but also in criminal justice. And there's a growing and growing in sophistication and also growing in just the amount of research that's going into algorithmic bias and algorithmic debiasing. And if anybody is interested in this, this is one of my professional interests, and I'd be happy to talk more and more about it. That's another 3 or 4 hour talk.
Yeah.
So thank you, May.
I'm interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Nicholas, sorry, your question, please.
Thanks, Teresa. Yeah, I'll keep mine incredibly brief since I know we have to wrap up. Peter, thank you so much for this talk. I know my intention in attending this talk was to better equip myself with some skills and knowledge and facts with tackling this area. Especially you acknowledged being a person of privilege or coming from a position of privilege. It's very important that we be engaging in these conversations. So my question is more of an interpersonal question, and I'd love to hear from you, and maybe by extension any of our priests in training who are on this call. But I know whenever I try to enter into conversations about economic or racial or home inequality, things like that, especially with other people of privilege or people who come from communities of privilege, I kind of seem to keep encountering two major type of pushbacks from them, which I think kind of impede this ability to have this conversation. And the first is kind of this myth that, well, I voted for a candidate, or I voted for a measure, or I did something to encourage there being some type of law on the books now that addresses racism, whatever. So that responsibility is on them now, which, this is not by any way to undermine the political process. That certainly has its place in helping address these, but that kind of seems to be the ending point of where this scope of responsibility stops for individuals. And then the second area that I seem to kind of come across a lot is someone who might now be in a position of privilege who previously was not. I kind of hear, oh, well, I grew up poor, or, well, I didn't really get access to education, or, I had my own type of problems, whatever, and here I am now. So, there's, you can do it too, that type of thing, which I think that's not quite compassion. That's not quite addressing the issue. I think it's kind of just some misplaced sympathy. So I'm wondering if you might have some advice or feedback on what can be our skillful means to enter into these very necessary conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. I think that's a really, really important question. I think that one of the first and most important steps that you can take is the same important step that you can take in engaging with racial justice and racial injustice, which is as we confront and particularly I refer to all of us, but I reflect particularly on my own position as a white male in society, in a very dominant position, in a very privileged position. In confronting racial injustice and the history of racism, I think one thing that's important to understand is our own personal responsibility and the way in which it manifests in every day, every minute of our life. The fact that I didn't vote for explicitly racist policies doesn't excuse me from the way in which my whiteness manifests itself in every moment of my day-to-day life and existence. And it's through understanding my own whiteness that I actually come to appreciate my responsibility and my interdependence and effect on the rest of the world. In a similar way, it's through understanding how my wealth and privilege manifests in my life and affects my day-to-day and thereby affects the entire rest of the world, that I've come to fully understand my responsibility and the consequences of my actions for the rest of society. So I think that the starting point here is in understanding and reflection, particularly in understanding and reflecting on our interconnection. And in doing so yourself, I think you'll be, and I have some faith in this myself on my part. I think that in reflecting on this, you'll be better prepared to have those conversations with other people who don't yet have a realization of how their privilege and their day-to-day action actually manifests and affects the rest of the world, in ways far beyond just the ballot box. But it is a very, very limited understanding to think that you don't have an effect, and to think that your day-to-day actions don't have consequences for everything else in the world. Thank you. I'd invite, to echo Nicholas's question, I'd invite anybody else to weigh in and comment as well on that. I think that's a really important point.
Wonderful. So I think we are almost on time today. Thank you very much for your presentation and for the future plans, Peter, I'm sure. Oh, Travis just sent a message to the chat. Reach Potential Movement.
Wonderful. Thank you, Travis. And if anybody's interested in talking more, I'll stay on afterwards, though, of course, it's important to end on time.
Yeah. Oh, Travis also recommended the CSA. I think the head of the CSA is coming to our next board meeting to do a presentation. So
I actually worked and volunteered with Reach Potential Movement for, probably close to a decade. So if anyone wants any contacts there or, to get in touch with them, I'm happy to introduce you. They're insane.
Thank you to Ria for her suggestion. I think it's a very interesting one about our garden and all that.
Which one? Sorry?
What Ria suggested about, maybe considering doing what this church where she and Travis were attending, that they have once a month, they serve food for homeless people.
Yeah, I actually also like Peter's suggestion with the parking lot. I mean, yeah, the parking lot's very large. So.
Just a quick reminder before we go, just want to remind everyone that these sessions are recorded and we want to respect people's privacy, but it's very hard if you tell us like a month later after we've already published the talks. So if you have anything confidential, please let us know right away so we can remove it before we post. Otherwise, it will go on YouTube as well as on the podcast, which is on Spotify and Apple Play and other things like that. So just letting you know. And thank you so much, Peter. This was like a really insightful talk. Yeah.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the privilege of having an opportunity to speak with you all.
Yeah, and I'll see you later, Peter, at the other class.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, you two have a busy day today, huh?
We do. Yes, we're going. We have a class later today, a Zen community, a class spanning Zen communities, examining whiteness.
Is it unpacking whiteness or examining whiteness? Yeah.
Unpacking whiteness, yes.
That's right. Yeah, it's been a fantastic course.
I would love to hear about it. I applied multiple times, but I don't qualify because I'm a person of color. So I would love to hear about how it goes.
Well, they ended up, at the beginning it was only for white people, but they changed it towards the end, and we have a group of also people of color, small group.
Well, I'd still love to hear about it. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I hope it's going well.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoy the irony of that.
Well, it actually made sense when I talked to them about it. It was because from their perspective, their priority was they really needed to educate white people about issues, whereas people of color already know about racism pretty well. So I think it was more, or implicit bias. So I think it was more due to bandwidth and also dealing with the nuances of all of the issues that come up. Like, for example, I'm a mixed race person, right? So there's all these different, it would probably be like a different class, but I was just like, well, I could audit, I could just listen. But no, I think it's, yeah, it is ironic, but I think the intention's in the right place. Yeah.
It makes sense, but it does kind of hang a sign on the class that says whites only. So.
It's interesting how it works out, but
I am glad that they did include people of color in the class. There's been some really, really, I think, helpful and challenging conversations about particularly the way in which white people can feel attacked and respond unskillfully when a person of color relates some aspect of their personal experience. And so ultimately, I think in the class, I understand the original logic, but I think that it has been made better by including some people of color that have given us opportunities to directly examine those kinds of dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd love for us to have a follow-up Buddhism in society, from what you learned. That would be really cool.
Yeah, I wonder, Teresa, I don't know if the Crystal, the person leading the course, might be interested in coming and speaking with us. But she's proven to be an absolutely fantastic facilitator.
Yeah, we could invite her.
I think that would be wonderful.
Mm-hmm. I also talked to Tova, and she suggested, I wanted to talk to you, Peter. She suggested maybe to create a group of us who could, maybe watch a movie and then comment it together or read a book. A lot of people are reading this book, My Grandmother's Hands. I don't know if any of you have read it. Anyway, we could each time somebody could propose a movie or a book, and then different people lead discussions.
That'd be great.
Okay.
So one thing that I'm thinking about, and I've been really encouraged during this talk to see so much enthusiasm, and it feels like there's an appetite for action, which I think is absolutely fantastic. What I was thinking is maybe it would be helpful, we could create a shared document and put all of our ideas in that, and then maybe come back together to discuss, whether or not there's one or two things that we might like to do collectively.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if we want to think about activities actually at Kannon Do, I think it would be important for us to discuss that at the Sangha meeting. And of course, I think it's important that we always remember to respect the Kannon Do neighbors. But I feel hopeful that there might be some things that we could actively do there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So do you want to start? Will you start
Yeah.
adopting?
Actually, perhaps I can easily start a doc and populate it with everything that's here in the chat, and also all of the things that I had in my notes. Maybe Teresa, would you be able to help me invite everyone who attended today to that document to edit?
Sure. Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. I don't think I have everybody's email address. I have many people's email addresses, but not everybody.
Yeah.
And I also know there were some people that really wanted to attend it and had to work, like Brenda expressed, you know, she was really wanting to attend.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well, thank you for the recording.
maybe in the future other people will join. To start somewhere.
Yeah, well, we can start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you for the talk, Peter.
Thank you, Nick.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Travis.
Thank you, Peter.
Peter.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Peter.